2009th year, UN General Assembly. This man is saying such words. This is commercial business. Capitalist companies create viruses to then produce and sell vaccines. This is very shameful and unethical. Vaccines and medicines cannot be sold. Medicine should be free, but capitalist companies produce viruses and vaccines and want to make money. Actually, isn't that true? Let's unravel this indicative story. Indicative in all senses. Libya. In a very short span of time, we saw its bloom and complete destruction. How did it happen that a country with a gross domestic product per capita of $14,000, which is higher than some Western countries, was practically wiped off the face of the earth? On the 1st of September, 1969, a notable communique number 1 was broadcasted on Libyan radio. Citizens of Libya, in response to your concealed desires and dreams that fill your hearts, in response to your incessant demands for change and spiritual rebirth, your long struggle in the name of these ideals, listening to your call for uprising, the military forces entrusted to you took on this task and overthrew the reactionary and corrupt regime, whose malice caused disgust and shocked us all. All sons of the desert and our ancient cities, our green valleys and beautiful villages, forward. On that day, the movement of free officers, unionist socialists, under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, overthrew the king and proclaimed the Libyan Arab Republic. Thus began a new era, which some will call the era of bloom, and others will call a period of tyranny and despotism. Gaddafi began by expelling all international corporations from the country and closing NATO military bases. And he began building the state. From the unification of tribes living on common territories to a modern state. This was the main slogan of the first decade of Gaddafi's rule. But the scattered tribes had no need for any statehood. The new policy faced growing dissatisfaction and opposition. In order to maintain power, Gaddafi turned to his tribe, surrounding himself with loyal people. He then realized a different path was necessary. And he found it, creating a unique, nowhere-else possible form of government. Thus was born not a republic or a monarchy, but a great socialist people's Libyan Jamahiriya, a unique mutant between tribal structure and centralized government. The experiment was very successful. From the deafening silence of the Libyan desert, it has transformed into a state with a very high standard of living. Just look at these numbers, which we can only dream of now. Every year, the state paid out $1,000 in subsidies for each family member. The unemployment benefit was $730, and the average nurse's salary was $1,000. Upon marriage, the newlyweds received $64,000 from the state to buy an apartment. And for each newborn child, the family received $7,000. Not a bad start for a new cell of society. If someone decided to start their own business, they received a one-time financial aid of $12,000. At the same time, large taxes and fees were prohibited. Education and medicine were free. Moreover, if someone decided to study and intern abroad, it was done at the expense of the state. There was also a special network of stores for large families with symbolic prices for basic food products in the country. There were no utility bills. Loans for buying a car and an apartment were interest-free. At the same time, the state paid up to 50% of the car purchase, and it gave 65% to the soldiers of the national militia from the amount. There were also special pharmacies with free dispensing of medicines. Gasoline was cheaper than water. 1 liter was 14 cents. In Libya, real estate services were banned, and the penalty for drug trafficking was death. Also, the sale and consumption of alcohol were prohibited. Dry law. 3/4 of the Libyans were illiterate until the late 1960s, and 10% of the population suffered from blindness due to total unsanitary conditions and almost complete absence of doctors and medical facilities. Gaddafi promptly started building hospitals, libraries, schools, and universities. By 1977, the literacy rate in the country had risen to 80%, and by 1990, it had almost reached 90%. What personal qualities must Muammar Gaddafi have had to create such an oasis out of the desert in such a short time? Well, he certainly wasn't an angel. Much is known about his love for women and luxury, as well as his harshness and vindictiveness. In Gaddafi's history, there are plenty of showdowns with political opponents. For example, in 1978, the leader of the Lebanese Shiites and founder of the Amal movement, Imam Musa al-Sadr, mysteriously disappeared during a visit to Libya. Gaddafi could reach his political opponents everywhere. It was impossible to hide from him across the border. In the first 25 years of his rule, 8 died in Italy, 6 in Germany, 5 in Greece, and 3 in Great Britain. Gaddafi's foes were killed in Austria, Spain, Cyprus, Lebanon, Malta, Poland, Romania, Saudi Arabia, and France. He destroyed them methodically and cold-bloodedly. Gaddafi was certainly ruthless, like actually everyone who plays big on the world chessboard. The United States of America, with events like Guantanamo, the atomic bomb, and Saddam Hussein's execution, can hardly be called good and just. There is also a brighter analogy with the head of Chechnya. There is even a special term, enemy of Ramzan Kadyrov. Such people also do not live long, and wherever they go, in whatever country they try to hide, death usually finds them there. This is a very interesting comparison. After all, Gaddafi led Libya for 47 years. Kadyrov also rose to power in Chechnya at a young age. Wisely distributing the oil that Allah gave, Gaddafi established a regime of unlimited power, cleared the political field, and eliminated the slightest possibility of any opposition emerging. All this occurred while he enjoyed a terrestrial paradise for himself and those close to him, with a peculiar form of socialism for his fellow citizens. The earthly paradise also has a story to tell. The exact number of properties and villas owned by Gaddafi, scattered around the world, is unknown. According to Libyan media, the personal fortune of the leader of Jamahiriya exceeded $200 billion. The colonel had a particular weakness for gold. From this precious metal, a couch in the form of a mermaid, an AK-47 automatic rifle, a clock, a golf cart, all table appliances, and even a fly swatter found in his house were made. Gaddafi's personal plane with a full-sized jacuzzi on board, was lined with silver. Clothes, plastic surgeries in a special bunker, world stars for a birthday, virgin bodyguards. Huge money was spent on all this. It got to the point where the colonel took chefs with him. Live camels came with them so that the Libyan leader could start each morning with a glass of fresh camel milk. As a result, trips abroad with camels became a tradition. Either way, to create what eventually came out of Libya, and in a fairly compressed time frame, one had to possess very specific human qualities, or not entirely human ones. This question is not just for Gaddafi, but for the power structures in most countries worldwide. For example, how to get into the circle of the world's leading special services. Gaddafi did this in a quite original way, which, indeed, a normal person would never understand. He began to support left-wing and national liberation movements all over the planet. In doing so, the distinctions between people's aspirations for freedom and terrorism, to put it mildly, were very blurred. Intelligent people know that most terrorist attacks are not insane acts of religious fanatics, but carefully planned operations by special services and intelligence agencies from various countries. At the same time, Libya was helping with money and weapons about 30 extremist organizations, including the Irish Republican Army, Basque Euskadi ta Askatasuna, Italian Red Brigades, Japanese Red Army, West German Army, Red Army Faction, Palestinian Abu Nidal Group, and many others. In 1986, a bomb exploded at one of the discos in West Berlin, which was often visited by American military personnel. 3 deaths and 200 wounded. The special services quickly found Gaddafi's hand, and years later this information was confirmed. In response, a pinpoint bombing of military targets in Tripoli and Benghazi was carried out, resulting in the death of dozens of civilians. After some time, in December of 1988, over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, passenger 747 exploded. 270 people died. 15 years later, to lift international sanctions, Libya admitted that its officials were responsible for the plane explosion. In September 1989, a plane performing Flight Union de Transports Aériens 772 from Brazzaville to Paris crashed to the ground. 179 people died. And the same situation. 15 years later, in 2003, Gaddafi announced his decision to pay compensation to the victims of the tragedy, underlining that he does not consider his country responsible for the terrorist act. Our dignity is important to us. Money is indifferent to us. The Lockerbie case is over. Now the UTIE case is closed. We are opening a new page in our relations with the West. It is believed that the plane explosions were organized by Libyan special services on Gaddafi's orders, as revenge for the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi. This is how a man who came to power at the age of 18 as a result of a coup and was able to hold this power for more than 40 years, until the 70s, acted. Few global political figures have achieved this. But what was the main crime of Gaddafi that the Western states could not forgive him under any circumstances? Gaddafi took on a very ambitious goal to strengthen African countries as a whole. He had the audacity to propose to African states the idea of ceasing to be a post-colonial appendage of the West. He wanted to change the fate that the United States of America and major European players had long prepared for these countries. And, what's most unpleasant, he was taking concrete steps in this direction. The dollar-based currency system has swallowed up all the countries of Africa, exploiting their natural resources, such as oil and minerals. In order to change this sad situation, Gaddafi planned to introduce the gold dinar as the main currency. Colonel Gaddafi had a global plan to create a strong union of African states, which would be based on this new economic system. The colonel offered this beneficial alternative primarily to the Islamic states of Africa, but also gave the opportunity to join the union to all other African states. The next crucial step that Gaddafi wanted to implement was to free his oil market from the dollar. Under the agreement with the United States of America, Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, from the 70s of the last century, Libya in the oil trade specifically in dollars, which of course was beneficial to the Western participants of the agreement. If Gaddafi had done this, other African and Middle Eastern oil and gas producers would have followed him. Gaddafi's new plan meant the creation of a completely new African banking system, which would not depend on Western, French, and British central banks. The West would hardly have survived such a blow to its system. That's why the world elite could not allow this in any form. There was another reason, also related to resources, but not to oil. Libya, Egypt, Chad, and Sudan are the floating countries. They are located on a huge mass of Nubian sandstones, up to 2 million square kilometers in size and 40 to 230 meters thick, with huge water reserves. The Libyans stumbled upon this treasure quite by accident. They discovered water in 1953 while trying to find oil sources. Only a couple of decades later, with the arrival of Gaddafi, did the country's inhabitants realize that they had a real treasure on their hands. Gaddafi began to implement one of the most grandiose projects in the history of irrigation systems. The colonel called it the Great Man-Made River. The construction of this large-scale facility could turn arid Africa into a blooming continent. This aligns with Gaddafi's goals. First, under his careful guidance, a project of a complex network of pipelines was developed. Their task was to deliver water from the Nubian aquifer to the arid regions of the country. Then, specialists from South Korea were invited to Libya, who brought with them the most modern technologies of that time. In El Barej, a factory producing reinforced concrete pipes with a 4-meter diameter was launched. On the 28th of August, 1974, construction began on a pipeline, which from 2008 is considered the largest irrigation project in the world, and that's even in an undeveloped state. Gaddafi's plans included not only the water supply of the country's cities, it was planned to cultivate and irrigate vast amounts of land in the future, and besides Libya itself, to include other African countries in this system. What happened in the end? Africa would not only stop being a perpetually starving continent, but it would become an exporter of agricultural products itself. The Western countries could never allow this to happen. After all, many of them were involved in supplying food to African countries. It was absolutely disadvantageous for them to transform Africa from a consumer into a producer. Furthermore, the world had been facing a severe freshwater scarcity for a long time. Almost 20 years ago, in the distant year 2003, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan stated that 2 billion people desperately need fresh water. And according to the World Bank's estimates, by the middle of the 21st century, 40% of the Earth's population will be experiencing a water deficit, and 20% will seriously suffer from it. It turns out that having water automatically made the Libyan leader one of the leaders on a planetary scale. At a commercial event dedicated to the completion of one of the stages of the great man-made river construction, Muammar Gaddafi made prophetic words. Now, after this achievement, the threats from the United States of America against Libya are doubled. Americans will do everything to destroy our efforts and oppress the Libyan people. And already in mid-February of the 12th year, mass anti-government demonstrations began in the country, which quickly escalated into an armed conflict between government forces and the opposition. In March, a military intervention in Libya by an international coalition began, which included NATO countries. At the end of August, with the support of NATO aviation, opposition forces took the Libyan capital, Tripoli. Everything went according to the already familiar scenario. Next, an independent strong leader was supposed to emerge out of nowhere. With the help of armed forces, he was supposed to bring order to the country and create a country comfortable for the West with a democratic facade. But something went wrong. After the fall of Muammar Gaddafi's regime, the country effectively split into several territories controlled by different groups. It was precisely after the overthrow of Gaddafi that international terrorists flocked to Libya in droves. Their impact on the country's domestic political landscape is increasing. The most terrifying consequence of the civil war in Libya was the death of several tens of thousands of people. A huge number of ordinary citizens lost their homes and began to emigrate to neighboring countries and Europe at the risk of their lives. By destroying the system created by Gaddafi, Western democracy did not quite get what it expected. But no one is going to admit their mistakes. After all, the main message was delivered. The world has no right to change against the will of those who call themselves the elite. Of course, the topic of Libya is not exhausted by this, but the time of our release is not rubber. Therefore, we will conclude. Let us know in the comments, did we miss something in this release? Or do you think the matter is completely different? Thank you for watching and see you on our channel.